Hello and welcome to A Novel Idea, the show where we introduce and talk to authors. My name is Noelle Bach. I am your host, and today I am with David S. Brody. Welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming down today.
Of course.
So we are here to discuss today your book, The Essex Junta.
Junta, right.
Junta, Newburyport and the Three World Wars. So right away, the pull is 3 world wars.
Right.
So, obviously we don't want to give away too much of the plot of the book because we want people to actually read it.
Yep.
But this book has a lot of really local history and facts in it, like mixed within a thriller storyline that I thought was just fascinating because I didn't know anything about any of this.
I didn't either. When I sort of fell into this story, I was looking at a local Westford historical figure named Albert Pike, who's a famous Freemason and Confederate general, and I was looking at some of his letters. I did not realize at the time that he was from Newburyport, and I had no idea that he was involved in this, we'll call it a conspiracy that brought about the Civil War and then maybe the World War I, World War II, and a World War III yet to come. But all of this came out of research involving Newburyport and a lot of the historical figures in the early and mid-1800s.
So give us this little bit of background, like who are the Essex Junta?
Right. So as the Revolutionary War ended, Newburyport was a bustling trading town. Ships, the clipper ships are going out and trading, and things were great. There was a lot of money in the city. And then a few things happened. There was a big fire in 1811. Before that, there was an embargo by President Jefferson in 1807, I believe. And then the War of 1812 hit. And all of that conspired to really kill the economy in Newburyport. And so a lot of the local shipping families, the leading residents, got together and said, this isn't working for us. The federal government is not supporting what we need to do. Let's talk about seceding from the Union. Now, we know the Civil War, the southern states did that, and everyone's like, how dare you? How could you possibly consider breaking up this beautiful United States we have? But it happened 50 years earlier in the North Shore. It was the Essex County shipping family, so it was called the Essex Junta. And this almost happened in 1805. Vice President Burr was working with them. Hamilton found out about it, called Burr out on it. That led to the famous duel, okay? Burr kills Hamilton, and that sort of kills the whole idea of secession for a while. It resurrects itself again in 1814 near the War of 1812. Near the end of that war, they're meeting in Hartford, Connecticut, the Hartford Convention. They're ready to make the move, and word comes down that the treaty has been agreed to for the end of the 1812 war. So for a second time, it doesn't happen. But I think what happened was, even after the War of 1812 ended, these local shipping families, many of them, continued to think we'd be better off seceding from the Union, and they continued to agitate for secession up to including the Civil War, and that may have been what brought about the Civil War. So this group of these families, these Essex County shipping families that were known as the Essex Junto, I changed the spelling to Junta because that's the modern usage. Junta, it means a secret society. But it's these families, and we recognize a lot of these names: Lowell, Cabot, Forbes, Weld, Ames, Perkins. These are some of the old Boston families, but they were the ones that we're talking about. Cushing is a big one. But it was a fascinating story. I didn't know anything about it. If you go to Wikipedia, you can look up Essex Junto. You can read about it, so it's there.
Yep.
But I had no idea how deep this conspiracy ran, how close that these families worked with a lot of what we call the secret societies, the Freemasons, the Illuminati, the Skull and Bone Society. All roads seem to lead back to Newburyport and these families and these secret societies. I was blown away by it.
Yeah, I was so equally, like, I read this book and thought, wait a minute, and like you say, I did go on Google and say is this real? I mean, you have historical notes and everything in there, of course, but I was like, what can I find out? Just doing a little bit of research, and I couldn't believe that this stuff was happening, and I have no idea. And and you think of how much when we're in school. Are you born and raised in Massachusetts?
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. So because the Revolution, so much of it centered and started in Massachusetts and the surrounding area, that we usually get pretty immersed in the role of New England in the American Revolution, American history,
Exactly, yeah.
and that this stuff was going on and that I had no idea about it was really just fascinating to me that I'd never run across any of it before. So I thought that was like just fantastic. Now you have like a really strong component of the Freemasons running through this as well, and of course we all have those National Treasure movies and things like that, right? Like that bring in already those kinds of thoughts about the Masons. Do you feel like the Masons actually do still hold a lot of power in America?
So I'm not a Freemason, but I do a lot of my books turn on Masonic themes because the Masons may have been founded by the remnants of the outlawed Knights Templar, and that's where I first started doing my research. So the Knights Templar were outlawed in 1307. They may have come back as the Freemasons, either physically came back as them or just spiritually sort of shared some of their beliefs and rituals. Either way, a lot of my themes are Masonic, and so a lot of the lectures I give and a lot of my audience is at Masonic lodges. So I do a lot of work with the Freemasons. And I think they're a wonderful organization, but they like to joke when they're asked a question, are you guys trying to take over the world? Are you part of this new world order? They laugh and they say, we can't even run a successful pancake breakfast. So we're not doing it. So I think the truth lies someplace in the middle. I think back during this time period where this book takes place in the 1800s, they were incredibly powerful. And there was definitely some evidence that people like Albert Pike, who's sort of a leading part of the story, was a leading Freemason in the late 1800s, that people at the top of Freemasonry back then were indeed looking to establish what we call a new world order, some kind of global governing body that would sort of rule things. And I think that as the decades have passed, Masonry has lost a lot of its power, it's lost a lot of its membership. They're down probably, I think they're down 60 or 70% from where they were at their peak. And they've lost a lot of their power. So I don't think that's going on today, although other conspiracy theorists do think that's happening. But I think back then in the 1800s, there's a lot to be said that the movers and shakers of society a lot of them were Freemasons. We know a lot of the founding fathers were Freemasons. We know that, Benjamin Franklin and George Washington were active Freemasons. And so there was definitely a component back then that Freemasonry was trying to share power with other governmental bodies. I think that's faded away, but I think it definitely was going on in the 1800s.
Now, so circling back around to Albert Pike. So the beginning of the story, won't give away much of this, is, but it's okay, it's the beginning. So we have some characters that you commonly use, right? So Cam and his daughter, Astarte.
Yes, nice job pronouncing, yeah.
Working on it. So she's renting a house in Newburyport. She ends up finding these letters tucked away in a coal bin. And they are purportedly letters from this Albert Pike.
Yes.
So and then they reference, sort of, getting back into these World Wars idea. So talk a little bit about Albert Pike, and then 3 World Wars.
So Albert Pike. So if you remember, I think it was 2020, there were demonstrations, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and there was one statue in particular that was pulled down in Washington D.C. because he was a Confederate general. That's Albert Pike. His statue stood not because he was a Confederate general, but because he was considered the man god of Freemasonry. He was a big Freemason during like 30 years in the late 1800s, and he wrote the book called Morals and Dogma, which is sort of the Masonic handbook, and he was the big guy. That's why his statue stood in Washington, D.C. But again, he was pulled down because he was a Confederate general. He was the grand dragon of his state Ku Klux Klan. He was part of the conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln. He had some ugly skeletons in his closet. It turns out, which I didn't know, that he was a son of Newburyport. He was born in Boston at age 3, moved to Newburyport, and spent his childhood there until he was about 22. He was admitted to Harvard University, showed up to pay his 1-year tuition, and they said, you owe 2 years tuition. And he said, why do I owe 2 years tuition? The answer to that question has never really been answered, but he ended up not going to Harvard. And instead, he taught school in Newburyport for a while, and then finally at age 22 made his way south to Arkansas, where he became a self-taught lawyer and a newspaper man, and eventually the head of the Confederacy, the general, and the Ku Klux Klan, and all that ugly stuff. But what happened was, after the Civil War, he wrote some fascinating letters to a fellow revolutionary in Italy by the name of Giuseppe Mazzini, who was head of something called the Illuminati. Okay, again, another secret society. And Mazzini was also a Freemason. And Pike and Mazzini were talking about this New World Order. Can we establish a secret governing body of Freemasons that's basically going to be a shadow government to rule the world? That's what they were trying to do at the time. Then we see this letter from Pike to Mazzini that talks about this vision he's had, or a dream he's had, or a plan he has. It's unclear whether he's just seeing this in the future or somehow orchestrating it. And in very specific detail, he outlines World War I, and he gets it right on the button. He really talks about it exactly. World War II, again, right on the button, about how Nazism and Zionism and the fall of communism, he really nails it. And then about World War III yet to come, which is going to be a clash between basically Israel and the Arab countries, the Islamic countries. And it's eerie how specific he is about these, but it's unclear as to whether or not this letter actually really exists or not. There's evidence that indicates it does, there's references to it, but no one actually has the actual letter. And the reason this becomes very interesting, and what triggers this whole story, is Astarte in this coal bin finds letters that were in reality found in Canada about 7 or 8 years ago, but we have them fictionally, we have them found in Newburyport. Some of Pike's actual letters to a comrade of his, to a compatriot of his who lived in Canada by the name of MacLeod. And in that correspondence, which was discovered in a Masonic lodge up in Canada, it looks like he's referencing the letter that talks about the 3 world wars. So it gives credence to the fact he actually did write this letter. And that's sort of the overview of this whole thing. Is it gives fuel to this. You know, we live in a time where everybody has a conspiracy theory, right? I mean, they're, 99% of them are probably wrong, but 99% of them are also believed. And one of these conspiracy theories is that the Freemasons and the Illuminati and the Skull and Bone Society at Yale, that they're still trying to run the world. And this kind of thing, these kinds of letters, this kind of evidence, gives fuel to those. And so as much as on the one hand I try to say, well, we need to be careful about jumping to conclusions and subscribing to all these conspiracy theories, on the other hand, I'm writing about them. So I'm sort of talking out of both sides of my mouth. And I'm guilty of that, I realize that. But it's fascinating on the one hand because it possibly could be true. On the other hand, I think we need to be careful about, it's one thing to play connect the dots, but we also need to know where to draw the line and say that's enough. So I like to say that there's definitely connections, there might be collaboration, but is that enough to give us conspiracy? Like, I'm just not sure how far along to go with this. And that's one of the themes of this book, and all of my books, is we have all of this conspiracy stuff out there today, and everyone loves a good conspiracy theory. Just like everyone loves a good treasure hunt, right?
Yep.
But that doesn't mean that you're always going to find the treasure, and it doesn't mean that every conspiracy theory is true. And so we live in a time today where lots of them get traction, probably more than deserve to be. And we haven't quite, as a country, I think, figured out how to deal with that. I mean, it seems like everyone today is allowed to have their own version of truth. It used to be when I grew up, we watched Walter Cronkite on the news, and whatever Walter Cronkite said, that was the truth.
Right.
Right? No one dared to question any of that stuff. Now, everything gets questioned, and because we believe nothing, in some ways that allows us to believe anything.
Right, yeah.
And we got to figure that out as a society. And so that's one of the themes I try to explore in this book. And it's probably not the exact answer to your question. I went off on a tangent there. I apologize. But,
no, that's fine.
But that's sort of, as I'm writing this, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I don't believe in all these conspiracy theories, and yet I'm writing about one right here.
Right,
and
right,
so,
yeah.
I sort of leave it up to my readers to decide which way to go on that. But I think it's important to say, again, connection could lead to collaboration, doesn't always lead to conspiracy. So all these characters were collaborating, but I'm not sure that leads to a modern day conspiracy.
Right, yeah. And when I was reading it, I said, I was, like you, blown away by some of these facts and history pieces that I didn't realize existed. Right. And that just this idea that people are in the background, potentially trying to foment war purposefully, right, to take over the world and bring in new world orders. So it's really interesting to think about the possibility that there are potentially people out there. Like I don't like to think about it that way, because then it just feels like you have no control, right? That there's there's all these big powers doing all these things.
And the thing about this particular story, which was so fascinating to me, is all of these people that supposedly were fomenting revolution and trying to take over the world, they all either were residents of Newburyport or were directly connected to Newburyport, and all these secret societies had close connections to Newburyport. Everything seemed to come back to Newburyport and the North Shore, and that was crazy to me. Like, there's 6 or 7 historical figures in the book, and they all have direct ties to Newburyport.
Which is, again, I never would have guessed. Like, I go to Newburyport, meet my friend for dinner, and like I wouldn't be like, oh yeah, Newburyport's got all these revolutionary characters that have been,
we know the
like,
clipper
running
ships,
around.
and we know the Coast Guard was founded there, and we go, like you said, a beautiful brick downtown, and all that stuff. But I did not know that, and it's either a huge coincidence, this cluster of families living related to this that lived in Newburyport, or I think again there was something going on. There's some kind of collaboration. Again, I'm not sure if it goes all the way to conspiracy, modern day especially, but back then, they were definitely, this Essex Junta group were definitely working to change the course of American history, if necessary to secede, if not necessary, then at least to redirect in a way that was going to benefit them.
Right. They're almost like a olden time oligarchy, right?
Yes,
like they were
very
just
much.
Sort of, hey, we're powerful families and we don't want to see our profits going away, and like, what can we do to, make everything keep it. And the other piece that's in here that I also didn't know about and was also completely shocked by was the pieces with the opium trade.
Yes.
And I didn't know anything about that either. I mean, I knew there was the opium trade, but I always blame Great Britain for that.
No, it was started with Great Britain, but a lot of the families on the North Shore trade families, they made a lot of their money in the slave trade. And then at some point, the slave trade, because of politics and because of laws and because of uprisings, that became less lucrative. And many of the trading families saw that the British traders had turned to opium, getting processed poppy out of India and bringing it up to southern China. And the English basically forced their way into Canton, China with gunboat diplomacy. And then the Americans said, well, we can do that also. And they sent an ambassador over there. And the ambassador they sent, Caleb Cushing, a son of Newburyport. Okay, so again, another tie to Newburyport. They sent Cushing over there, and Cushing went in with his gunboats and said, if you let the English do it, you have to let us do it. And the Chinese were basically defenseless against the size of our gunships, our warships. And they said, okay. And then at one point, literally 90 million Chinese, a third of the population, was addicted to opium. And this was huge profits to come back to the North Shore, to Essex County, devastated the Chinese for generations, of course. But a lot of that money is what fueled, and then these families, these are the big families of a lot of the names I mentioned earlier, but the money that came back was used for things like Mass General Hospital, the Museum of Fine Arts, Perkins School for the Blind, McLean Hospital, some of our great institutions, but that's all opium money.
Yep.
But you're right, so I didn't know about the big trade in opium that we had. I knew about the slave trade. We'd heard about that in high school, the triangular trade routes and stuff. But opium replaced the slave trade, and that was a big part of what was going on in Essex County.
Yeah, I've been talking to people about this since I found out about it. I'm like, drug money, man. Like we've literally built some of these great things, like the Perkins School for the Blind and the Mass General Hospital, like with drug money. I think it's in your book too. Do you mention George Peabody in your book?
Peabody,
as well?
yeah. I mean, we're talking Danvers, but Peabody is,
Yeah. So like, so I work at the Peabody Institute Library, down the street, and like I always say, oh, George Peabody's the founder of our feast, because he built these libraries all up and down the coast here as well, and did a lot of wonderful things with his fortune. But I was kind of like, oh, some of his fortune was drug money.
He financed a lot of that. So a lot of these families, I think, sort of felt guilty about the origins of their money, and they did some wonderful philanthropic things with it. So good for them, the next generation, whatever. But and that sort of ties into another part of this story, which people, conspiracy theorists make the argument, well, these families back in the 1800s are doing X, Y, and Z. That proves they're doing it still today. And I have a real problem with that. I think that if you look at even today in modern political families, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., how he does not walk in lockstep with his family. Right. Ronald Reagan son Ronnie does not walk in lockstep. Donald Trump's niece Mary does not walk in lockstep. The British royal family. So the idea that because in the 1800s these families were participating in this conspiracy does not mean that 4 or 5 generations later that the modern day family members are still doing the same thing, which is what the conspiracy theories want you to believe. I just don't think that's realistic. My politics are a lot different than my grandfather's politics, and my father's politics, and I'm sure my daughters are going to be different than mine. So that whole thing, that lockstep family, generation after generation, I don't believe that either. But these family names that go back there, John Forbes Kerry, the Kerry family, the Bush family, the Weld families, a lot of these are still Harriman, Cabot. A lot of these families are still in power today. So we see the continuation, but I don't think that, again, continuation does not necessarily mean conspiracy.
Right, yeah. So all of that's, I mean, I was blown away by all of that history. So it was really great to me to like read through this. So let's just talk a little bit. So I don't want to give away like the plot or anything.
Thank you.
Because it's very hard with thrillers because you really can't talk about it almost at all without giving stuff away. And you weave in like a whole like bunch of different things. One of the pieces though that I thought was really cool is that you do bring in some of the Native American culture and pieces of that piece of America, right? Like of some of that, which I think is just a nice other interesting piece to bring into the storytelling, right?
So the main character, Cameron Thorne, he's an attorney turned historian, which a little bit based on myself. He's a taller, more handsome, smarter version of me. Okay, but he and his wife adopted a Native American girl when she was 5 years old. Her name's Astarte, and so she's the Native American. She's part of the Mandan tribe, which is a tribe that was mostly wiped out by the smallpox epidemic, but they were in the Dakota region when the colonization occurred across America. But Astarte has a very strong Native American identity, and that plays, as you said, plays an important role in the story. That because the Native American legends tell us a lot about our country's history, and the other interesting tie-in was that Albert Pike, who I mentioned, who was this Confederate general and a virulently anti-racist, although he was racist to African Americans, he was very supportive of Native Americans. And that's an interesting dichotomy as well. Why in his mind did he distinguish between one group of non-Caucasians and another? But so I go into that a little bit too. But the Native American aspect, I go down the rabbit hole a lot to look at early American history, even history of America, even before Columbus, and the Native American understanding of that and oral history regarding that is very important and also often ignored aspect of what we know or what we should know about pre-traditional American history.
My younger sister lives in Santa Fe, and I go out and visit quite frequently. And I've been to the history museum that they have there, about the whole state, and just the rich history that they have. That we're always just like, oh, all this stuff on the East Coast and everything happened here first, but predates.
Yeah, Santa Fe is the oldest settlement in America.
Yes, yeah, and like has the oldest church and like has just a whole bunch of things, and just the Spanish trying to push up from Mexico and south and trying to colonize the area, like well predates any of the other European things that were happening over on this coast. And so I always say like, wow, like there's just so much going on that we don't think about. We just have such a straightforward view of history, and like I think that's one of the great things about a book like this, or some other just going to other places, is like being able to have that breadth of history that we don't get in class, right, when we go through school.
Yeah, we think of Plymouth Rock as being the first, beginning of American history.
Or maybe Jamestown, right?
Yeah,
or whatever, right?
Jamestown,
like, that's
Roanoke Colony.
Roanoke and whatever. Yeah, like that's like where we go. Now, what are you working on right now?
So I've got, so this is the 19th book in the series or something, I believe. Yeah. So I'm working on the 20th. So again, most of the stuff I write about has to do with the Knights Templar, and of course, when you talk about the Templars, you can't help but talk about their treasure, because they were outlawed in 1307. They were incredibly wealthy. Their treasure disappeared. No one knows what happened to it. And there, when I talk about the Templar treasure, we're also talking about the stuff that was found underneath the Temple of Solomon. So the Ark of the Covenant, the Golden Menorah, maybe the Holy Grail. It's also a lot of the Judeo-Christian treasures. So AI is a big thing now. So the book I'm writing now deals with, can a really sophisticated AI model, taking all the evidence we know about the Templars and their travels and what the treasures were and where they were, can the AI model figure out the most likely spot for the Templar treasure? So I'm having some fun with that. I'm not really a great tech guy, so the AI stuff is a little bit over my head, but I've got some people helping me. But I do know a lot about the Templars. I know a lot about their treasure. I know a lot about history, so I'm able to sort of have some fun with it. And there's probably 7 or 8 different spots where the treasure might be. Maybe some of your viewers watch something called The Curse of Oak Island on Tuesday nights on the History Channel, which is up in Nova Scotia. That's one of the popular places where the Templar treasure might be. And so that's one of the possibilities. But there's like 7 or 8 good possibilities for the Templar treasure. So I'm trying to use AI to pin it down.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah. Do you have a publication date for that, or
I do? I do 2 a year. So I try to release every fall and every spring. So May-ish, maybe June. And I'm really good. We talked off air about writing every day. I write every single day because I really think it's important to stay with your story. And I try to do 2 every year just because I can. And I think readers like it when you publish frequently. Otherwise, they forget you and go off and read somebody else. Like we talked about Geraldine Brooks off the air. She's every 3 years. I'm like, do another one quicker. I love her writing. I'm waiting for her. But I understand why it's hard to do. She writes so beautifully. It's hard to do quick like that. But I try to do 2 a year.
Yeah, it's very different writing thrillers, than writing like those historical mixed novels. I don't know what we call them really, but it's sort of historical fiction, but it mixes together with modern day. So do you have a library card?
I do have a library card, yes. Why? Not with me. Do you need to borrow it? Or?
No, I always ask everybody. Since I'm a librarian, I'm always like, do you have a library card?
Yeah, I have a library card from the Boston Public Library that I've had for years. And I have one from the J.V. Fletcher Library in Westford, where we grew up. And I have one from the Newburyport Library. So
look at that. Good.
I've got a whole wallet full of them.
You're my favorite.
Oh, good. Thank
you. Well, I think we've run through our time. We've talked about so much, but thank you so much for coming on the show. Like that was really great. And I'm going to look forward to reading more of your books. And
thank you.
I was just going to say to any of our viewers too. Go to Newburyport and follow some of this. You can look up some of the things that happen in this book and some of these places. And I think
a lot of these places, you can go see them. The buildings that I talk about, they're there. So so
I think that's a really, really cool. You should put on a map on your website or something like that. So thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that you'll join us for future episodes as well. See you next time.